Or to the cloud. All right, so we just started. We're just going to wait a little bit for people to enter on in, and then we'll get on started.
Sure.
We're on the record.
You are.
Notice how that just silences us.
It's always an awkward like 30 seconds.
Yeah.
But people are trickling in. Hi, everybody.
I miss readings. I miss real readings. I mean,
Yeah, they're starting back up, but it's nice that people like who are based outside of the country and outside of the state can still do events. So
totally.
It's a mixed bag.
Trade-off.
Yeah.
But it would be nice to be in the same room, wouldn't it? Someday.
Yeah. I recently had some in-person events. It was really nice. Yeah.
All right, why don't we get started? Good evening and welcome to tonight's event with Greenlight Bookstore. I'm Shani and I'm thrilled to be hosting tonight's event with Maayan Eitan, launching her new book, Love. She will be talking with Elisa Albert, so you're in for an excellent time. Before we start, I just want to say a huge thanks to Maayan, Elisa, and the team at Penguin Press for making this happen, and to all of you for showing up. We're grateful for your support and for the chance to make space for conversation and connection. Now, just a couple of housekeeping things. In the Zoom webinar tonight, you can see and hear the speakers, but they can't see or hear you. They can see that you're here, though, and a couple of ways you can interact with the authors and with each other are A, through the chat, which you can find by clicking on the icon that looks like one speech balloon, and you can put your comments and thoughts there. And B, if you have a specific question you'd like to have answered by the author, please post the question in the Q&A module. You can find it by clicking on the icon that looks like two speech balloons, and we'll only be pulling questions from there, so make sure to put them there. Tonight's featured book, Love, is available for sale from Greenlight Bookstore. You can shop in person from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m. at both our Fulton Street and Flatbush Ave stores, or order online at greenlightbookstore.com for a quick pickup at the store or for shipping anywhere in the US. I'll be dropping the buy link in the chat every so often. As a thanks for attending tonight's virtual event, we're offering 10% off the featured book. Just enter the coupon code GreenlightEvents10 into the coupon discount section. Our interviewer tonight is Elisa Albert, whose third novel, Human Blues, will be published in July. Elisa will be speaking with our featured author, Maayan Eitan. Eitan's short fiction and essays have been published in the Kenyon Review and World Literature Today. Can you hear me? Okay. She holds a master's degree in comparative literature from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and is currently pursuing a PhD in Hebrew and literature in Israel. She lives in Tel Aviv. Eitan's new book, Love, is a fever dream of a novel about a young sex worker whose life blurs the boundaries between violence and intimacy, and objectification and real love. Startlingly vulnerable and lyrically deft, Eitan's deft debut follows Libby as she goes about her work in a nameless Israeli city, riding in cars, seeing clients, meeting and befriending other sex workers and pimps. Prose, as crystalline as it is unflinching, brings us into the mind of her fierce protagonist as Libby spins a series of fictions to tell herself and others in order to negotiate her life under the gaze of men. Maayan is going to start us off with a reading from the book, and then she'll be talking with Elisa and with all of you. So please take it away, Maayan.
Thank you, Shani, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to read from the 5th chapter of the book titled Men Looked at Me. And this was the first chapter that I actually wrote. Men looked at me. They stared at me when I sat alone in the cafes, searched for my eyes when I walked past them in the street. They called me names, sweetheart, love. They kissed me with their eyes closed and stroked my face with their fingertips. I pushed my body against theirs, held their flesh, told them my secrets. They didn't want to hurt me. I am not strong. You never know how much I could suffer. I wore my ring on a thin chain around my neck. At first, I felt its absent weight on my finger, then I forgot about it. I found other things to do. Wandering the city cafes with nothing to do, I pulled books out of my bag but did not read them. Men looked at me. If there was need for it, they'd ask for my number or leave theirs, but I preferred joining them in their rooms. They cooked black coffee on the stove while I threw up the contents of my stomach in their bathrooms, recited poetry to me. We smoked together. Then we had sex, their stubble scratching my inner thighs, the house cat jumping around us. Their semen never had any flavor. I bit them. They didn't bite back. I waited for them to fall asleep before I got out of there. I'm not pretty. Men looked at me. They talked to me, stopped me on the street, in bars, in cafes. We spoke. They went to the world's top universities, wrote books, poetry. They came in my mouth, my ass, on my breasts and belly. Their cum was thick and sharp, dark almost. I slowly gathered my clothes, even though their eyelids were heavy and they weren't looking at me. Then I got out of there. Men looked at me. They stared at me, bared their teeth when they smiled to me. They had money. The whiskey we drank was well-aged. They had heavy carpets, large TV screens, clothes made of expensive fabrics. I nodded when they spoke. Any other reaction would have been impolite of me. I bought new clothes every day, thin black silk tops that felt strangely chilly when they slipped across my belly as I took them off. I pocketed a bottle of perfume. I liked its name. I fell asleep with their arms around my waist, but my sleep was erratic, brief, and eventually I slipped from under their bodies, put on my clothes again, and got out of there. I'm not pretty. At first, I forgot their names, then the sight of their homes, their bodies, the things they told me. Finally, I decided to go to the hospital. The money I had in my wallet was exactly enough for the disposable razor and the taxi fare. I tore the plastic apart with my teeth in order to take the blade out of it. I am not pretty. I returned the next morning. Men looked at me, smiled to me when I passed them on the street, said that I was pretty when I asked them. I was running out of money. The eyeshadows I bought were expensive, the dresses, the high heels with the black thin ankle straps. In cafes, I ordered cheap drinks, then progressively more expensive ones. I ate only rarely. When my money was almost completely gone, I looked for a job, but the food joints and big business owners refused to hire me. I'm not pretty. Men looked at me. I walked them home arm in arm. I rode in their cars with them. They had goosebumps when I touched them. I'm through, I thought. I'm really through now. They fell in love with me. When I snuck out of their bedrooms at dawn, I looked in their wallets. Before I took the blade out of the razor, I checked which bus line stopped by the hospital. My silk blouses stuck wet to my wrists and were completely ruined. I returned 3 days later. Men looked at me. They bought me presents, gave me money. I laughed loudly when they complimented me. I'm not pretty. They slept with me, pouted when I didn't come. I wore lace-up nylons. When I returned home, I showered or did not shower. Men looked at me. They touched me, pulled up the hem of my dress on the steps of the lifeguard tower on the beach. Winter will soon be here. When they left, I stuck out my finger and drew long, deep lines in the sand. Then I put it in my mouth and chewed the sand that got stuck to it. It had no flavor, but men looked at me. So this is not the end of the chapter, but it's the first part of it.
Thank you. Here's the part where if we were in a room together, you would get some applause. Your energy would swell. Thank you. So that was the first section you wrote.
Yeah, it was the first chapter I wrote. It's now the 5th chapter in the book, so it's relatively still in the beginning. I wrote it it was actually March 2013. I was on a leave of absence from the University of Michigan where I was supposed to write a dissertation in comparative literature. I was utterly miserable. All I did was sit in cafes in Tel Aviv. I was again on a leave of absence. And it just sort of came out of me in this mysterious way in which sometimes writing works.
You were like a channel, and it came through you. You weren't
Sort of. It just happened.
You weren't like, I'm going to sit down today and write about a sex worker.
No, never.
No. That's super interesting. So from here, you just kept that channel open and saw what was there, kept writing vignettes.
Yep, pretty much. My first idea was to write about someone as miserable as I was back then. The sex work came much later.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sex worker. What do you think of that term, sex worker?
It's funny because in Israel, and the book was published 2 years ago in Israel in Hebrew. In Israel, I would never use this term. I would say something along the line of either a prostitute or a woman in prostitution, which is similar to how we would, I think today say people with disabilities and not disabled people. And a few weeks ago, I sent one of my very feminist professors from Michigan. I wrote her and I asked for her address to send her the book. And I said that the book is about a sex worker. And she responded quite fiercely. And she said that from her point of view, it was neither sex nor work, which is something that I can identify with. I think the discourse around sex work and prostitution in Israel is probably somewhat different than the discourse in the US, with which I'm not extremely familiar.
Right.
But I think the language matters a lot, because I would even feel in events that took place in Israel in Hebrew, I would feel uncomfortable saying prostitute. I would say isha beznut, a woman in prostitution, or a survivor of prostitution.
And is that
politics is very interesting.
Is that sort of how the discourse is going in Israel? Like those terms are like slide off the tongue, so to speak?
Yeah.
And what do you think your professor meant, neither sex nor work? Did she elaborate? I'm assuming it was a she. Look at me.
Yeah, it was a she. Well, I think she has a point. I mean, it's the idea that what sex workers or prostitutes do when they have sex is the same thing that we non-prostitutes, non-sex workers do when we have sex. The idea that both acts are similar is disturbing. I think it is easier to separate the two from a sort of a liberal feminist point of view. I think the whole idea in my book is that those arcs are essentially not that different.
Well,
so
certainly
would be my take on it.
Certainly, it's a different story from the perspective of a person in prostitution and a person who is availing themselves of the services of a person in prostitution, right? So if you pay for it, you don't have any responsibility to that person.
Right.
It's a lot easier, ostensibly, I imagine, I'm projecting, no baggage, no expectations, no feelings, all the things that are so cumbersome and annoying, ostensibly, right?
Right.
Can we still say John? I'm not really familiar with like contemporary discourse around sex work, quite honestly.
Yeah, I think clients
John.
are, yeah,
Client.
John, client. Yeah.
Client.
Yeah.
Sounds like interior decorating then, really. It's like,
Yeah, that's true.
language is tricky. But hold up, speaking of language, I'm very curious. Did you write in Hebrew when you were starting this, or was it always in English?
No, I wrote in Hebrew. I wrote in Hebrew. The book came out, only then I translated it into English. Yeah. And
what happened? Like, what was that transition like for you? That's fascinating.
It was, as a scholar of literature, and as someone who read at least some of the theory surrounding translation, I'm supposed to probably say something about the untranslatability of texts. But the fact is that as soon as I started translating the book, which happened on a whim, it was late at night, my then boyfriend was asleep, I was bored, I had the book in front of me and I wanted to write something, but I didn't have yet an idea for a new book project. So I just told myself, well, you could just try translating it. And by the end of that night, I had the first part of the book in English. And I felt quite secure that it was indeed translatable and possible to translate it. And then, of course, I edited it and retranslated some of the parts. But the sheer joy that I felt when by, I don't know, it was probably 6 or 7 in the morning a.m. when I finished, I really felt that I managed to transfer some of the book's most essential characteristics into a different language.
Wow, what an experience! It's something that a person who is monolingual will never ever have. It's just to be able to move between worlds that way. Is it a different animal, do you think? The Hebrew version and the English version?
It's I think there's the Hebrew, I mean, it's very similar. I think the difference lies in the way it was read by Hebrew readers and the way that it might be read by English speaking readers. The Hebrew original is filled with allusions to Hebrew poetry and some prose, and not only to Hebrew poetry, but to mostly American and British poetry as well. So I think and some of those allusions I managed to Americanize in the translation. But I think that for Hebrew readers, there's perhaps an added layer of meaning that at least in some points I had to was just lost.
Right.
But on the other hand, even in the part of the chapter that I read, there's a tiny quote from the last line of Sylvia Plath's Daddy. I think it goes, Daddy, you bastard, I'm through. And what I did with it was to take that I'm through and put it in a sentence in which Libby, the protagonist, says something along the lines, men fell in love with me. They had goosebumps when they touched me. I'm through, I thought, I'm really through now. So in the Hebrew version, I had to translate Sylvia Plath into Hebrew. And I think none of my Hebrew readers recognize this particular allusion, which can be recognized by American and English-speaking readers.
Yeah. You got a Tracy Chapman shout out in here at some point.
That's true. The original is a very famous Israeli song about driving in the car in the night in the rain.
By who?
By a singer called Arik Einstein.
Okay, yeah.
Very famous Israeli singer.
I'm familiar.
So it's a great song. It's about driving in the night in a car. And the Tracy Chapman line just popped in my mind, and I thought it was the proper equivalent.
That's so interesting. Is it easy or convenient for you to put a link to that song in the chat? I think that would be really fun. Can you multitask? Is that
let's see.
Since we're in this virtual tunnel together, cave, I don't know. I want to hear the original.
I'm doing it. I'm listening, and I have the link.
Tracy Chapman, that song has to be an internationally recognized motif unto itself now, doesn't it? I mean, does Fast Car by Tracy Chapman come on in the drugstore in Tel Aviv?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, it's like wallpaper around the globe forever.
Yeah, that's 7-Eleven would put it. Yeah. And it's a great song.
It's a great song, except nobody who can hear it anymore.
Yeah, that's true.
It's, it's wrung out. Here we go. I'm excited to hear this song. Okay, thank you. Excellent.
It's called Drive Slowly. Yeah.
Okay, so when this book came out in Israel, people kind of lost their minds about it. Is that fair to say? Yeah. Can you describe like what happened and how it was for you, and how it unfolded and what the fallout was?
So the book came out in Hebrew in March 2020. It was in the stores a week before the first lockdown. So I think that people actually had more time to read, and lots of them found their way to the book. And at first I received, there began to sort of materialize sort of a buzz on Facebook. In Israel, the literary feed exists on Facebook, not on Twitter. We're far behind.
Weird.
Yeah, and it's a very lively one. So people were posting about reading the book and their thoughts about the book. Then quite quickly, I think really no one had nothing to do. People were laid off their jobs, and school was happening on Zoom. So people really had time to read. And the book was very timely, even in the sense that it's a really short novel or a novella. I remember as a child listening to writers speaking about their work, and many of them said something in interviews, something along the lines of, I wrote the book that was missing on the bookshelf. Just kind of a sort of megalomaniac thing to do. So I felt that I wrote the book that I was capable of reading.
Mhm.
And I think many people felt this sentiment. The book was short enough. It's very dense,
Yeah.
but it's short. And it was available at a time when publishing houses stopped getting their books to the stores because the stores were closed and people had more time. So the first reactions that I got were really on Facebook, and then the reviews came out, and they absolutely stunned me. I was really fortunate to have really serious readings of the book made by reviewers whose work I admired for years. And the other sort of issue that was brought up around the publication of the book was that many people, I mean, the book does deal with questions of truth and fiction. At some point towards the end of the book, Libby, the protagonist, says something along the lines of truth was another commodity I had no interest in. So many people actually wondered whether this was a work of fiction or a work of autofiction.
Yes, they do.
Autofiction is a very popular genre in Israel and has been for the past few years. For a lot of my events, I had to answer the question of whether I researched the topic before writing the novel, which was a polite way of actually asking whether I experienced this kind of life. And I think that I was able to predict this sort of discourse and put answers for it in the book. It was very interesting for me. I'm thinking about the Miranda July quote, which I once read, I think in an interview. And she says that women writers are often conflated with their narrators, as if women writers cannot invent worlds of fiction from the ground up and can only write diary entries. And I think this captures something that is very true about how the work of women writers is perceived. So for me, it was important not to answer the question of what parts of my own biography did I put in the novel, in the book. I think this is essentially an unfeminist question to ask.
Amen. Amen. So how did you duck that question? What did you say? What were your maneuverings? What did you say?
So I quoted Miranda July quite a bit. I also said something, I think, about it goes back to the question of what I think about the terminology of sex work. I think that in today's world, a person does not have to experience sex work in order to understand how it feels to be a woman in a world where other women's bodies are bought and sold. It affects us all, I think. I did insist on my right as a writer to speak in voices that are not mine, that are not my own. I think that this is what we do as writers. We invent, we use our imagination. So when I was asked, and I'm still asked, I had an event last month, and this question always pops up, whether what kind of research did I do? Did I
research? What a great euphemism in this context. Wow. Shameless.
So I to that I mostly answered that I lived in a single woman in a big enough city. I experienced different relationships with men. I know how power relations feel as a woman. I know how it feels to be looked at, and I just added the money, and it was enough.
Mm-hmm. Have you heard that line? It's I don't know who to attribute it to. That everything in the world is about sex except for sex, which is about power. If anyone knows who to attribute that to, please.
Yeah,
please.
I don't know, but I've heard it.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah.
Did you have any experience with actual sex workers or survivors of prostitution or people in the prostitution trade saying, excuse me, but if you haven't actually come out of this experience, then don't you dare speak?
Yeah. Again, on Facebook, which was an easy platform for me to say that that essentially it was nobody's business whether I had this kind of experience or not, and that I think that there's a difference between arguing this sort of argument when you've read the book and when you haven't.
Sure.
And mostly from people who read the book, I think that eventually the book is about prostitution, right? About sex work. But sex work also serves as a metaphor in the book. And I think that the readers were able to recognize the inner works of this metaphor. And as they did that, it really stopped to matter whether it was based on my biography or not. It really, this question it was nullified.
Right. Well, the question of biography is always used as a tool to not engage, as an excuse not to engage with the actual text.
Right.
The text itself, usually offers, hopefully, ideally offers enough, more than enough. But, we don't have to engage with the text at all if we can sort of discount it on those grounds or raise that question as a way of excusing ourselves from engagement. It's a weak move. It's a weak move. Will you tell me about your epigraph and how you came to read Christine de Pizan?
The book of the city, the book of the City of Ladies. It was actually assigned as a weekly reading in one of my graduate seminars in Michigan. It was presented to us as one of the first and most fundamental feminist texts in Western culture. I then bought the book. I think we were supposed to read the first chapter. I bought the book, and I fell in love with this quote, which turned into the epigraph and sort of the motto of the book. And I think what I like about this quote especially is the ironic tone of it. It's maybe should I read it?
Please. Yes.
Yeah. So it goes like this. And I finally decided that God formed a vile creature when he made woman. And I wondered how such a worthy artisan could have deigned to make such an abominable work, which, from what they say, is the vessel as well as the refuge and abode of every evil and vice.
Yes.
And of course, Christine.
From what they say.
Yeah, right. Of course, she's being utterly ironic, and it was important to me. The book is, when I read it nowadays, it is a not undepressing book to read, to put it this way. But it was important to me to keep my protagonist's voice, to keep its irony and sometimes even humor,
Yes.
to make this book and the materials with which it deals not necessarily easier to digest, because I think it is not our job to make our reader's life easier necessarily. But in creating this character of Libby, the protagonist, I wanted to write someone who was as ironic towards sex work as she is ironic toward bourgeois notions and heteronormative relationships, especially in the second part of the book. And this sense of irony, which I think is reflected in the epigraph, was extremely important to me.
Yeah. So you had the epigraph for some period of time, sort of hanging around in your psyche on a.
Yeah,
I
always, in general, I always have the epigraphs before I have even the title of the work.
Yeah. What you were just talking about in terms of a sense of irony and a sense of humor, almost, or just enough. I think it takes a thread of detachment for a narrator or a protagonist to be able to be situated in a place where they can relay a story.
Right.
If you lack that, there's no way to make narrative.
Right. You need a perspective.
Maybe just a shred, but that brought to mind, this is my favorite line from the book, one of my favorite lines. And we laughed everywhere around the world. We laughed. And if you joined us and laughed, you'd be saved. And if you cried, you died. I repeat, if you cried, you died.
Yeah.
Love that line.
Thank you.
It speaks so beautifully to what narrative building can do for a reader, for a writer, for an imaginary character, for everyone involved.
Yeah, I agree. It's the power of language, right?
Yeah.
It's
like a triad, right? Like the reader, the writer, and the character, protagonist, all in this web of relation together, surviving somehow, beautifully done. Have you read Ariana Rain's Coeur de Lion?
No.
I wish we were in person and I would just hand it to you and say, enjoy. I think you would like it a lot. And it's a literary relative to what you've done here, I would say.
I'll make sure to order it.
And the other thing that came to mind a lot is Merritt Tierce, whose first novel, Love Me Back, was published in the States a few years ago, handful of years. I think you would like that. What kind of American literature and translation do you see in Israel? How's that pipeline work for you guys?
That's a good question. I'm not sure that I'm the right person to answer it. Most of what I read was written quite a long time ago, to the extent that when I come to read a work that was published, say, after the 1960s, I feel very contemporary. But I think that most I'm really trying to think about I think the last book that I read, contemporary work that I read in translation, was Garth Greenwell, What Belongs to You. So that was translated into Hebrew, I think, in the same year that it came out in the States. Cleanest was not, or is not yet translated, and I don't believe it will be, but I might be wrong. I think quite a lot of, quote, serious literature. By that I mean, obviously popular literature is translated into Hebrew, but also more complex works like Greenwell.
More complex work. That's a sex worker, research, more complex work.
Yeah, that's true. I'm really not sure I'm the right person to answer this question.
Do you read in Hebrew and English as you see fit? Do you move back and forth?
Yeah, I do. I read quite a bit in English. And in Hebrew, I make sure to read novels written by my friends. So this is most of the contemporary literature that I read was written by people I know. The literary circle in Israel is relatively small, and everyone knows everyone.
And is it friendly? Is it supportive and friendly?
It is supportive and friendly. It is. It actually is. Yeah.
What do you do when you read a book by somebody you think is a swell person and you just think the book is shit?
Well, it depends. I find that when it's close friends, you always find a way to like their work, and to see the more, say, successful aspects of it. It's really difficult for me to hate the work of a friend. But I think there's very interesting literature written today in Hebrew. Almost none of it is translated into other languages.
We don't get a lot of it.
Yeah.
It's like you, Edgar Carrot, David Grossman, Amos Oz. Who else?
And I think that there's a barrier, which I can't really explain. But the publishing houses in Israel translate quite a bit of European languages, European literature, written in different European languages. And it's a very lively market. Still.
I was told years ago by an Israeli literary agent or scout that that Israelis don't want to read about American Jews. It's like the bottom of the list. Like Israelis are, they'll read American fiction as long as it's by Gentiles. They don't want any of this like bullshit American Jewish identity. Like, no.
because Philip Roth and Saul Bellow have been translated into
Yeah, but that's like
into
it,
Hebrew.
like the end.
But
Done.
also Joshua Cohen's Netanyahu was just translated into Hebrew.
Good.
It came out I think 3 months ago.
Good.
In a small publishing house, that's true, an independent publishing house, but it was translated and it was reviewed by all major newspapers.
Good, because that book is pure genius.
Yeah, I agree.
Just, yeah.
Yeah.
Inarguable.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, maybe things are evolving. Maybe things are changing. I mean, things
Yeah.
are always, by definition, evolving and changing. So, okay, I'm supposed to ask if we have any questions. Oh, Nell Zink. Wow. Hi, Nell Zink. Big fan.
Hi, Nell.
Is the title ironic?
The title is definitely ironic. It's first and foremost, it's ironic. But it's also, I mean, when you think about the first part of the book, which described the Libby's encounters with clients or Johns or whatever you call it, the title is definitely ironic. The second part of the book, which is called Love, the title sort of becomes less ironic because I think there's something very real and honest about Libby's search for love and her attempt to understand why love evades her and escapes her. I think the ending of the book, without spoiling it, can be read in different ways, in more and less optimistic manners. I think that for Libby, love is a very serious issue. And the second part of the book, I think that if there's a way of redemption for this character, it has to do with her honest search for love. So the title becomes less and less ironic as the book progresses and eventually ends.
That's the thing with irony. It's a shapeshifter. It's
right.
It's not a static proposition.
Right.
The violence. You bring up the ending. That's really. Do you have a preference in how that's read? Do you have a leaning?
That's a question I often ask myself. Of course, I would have liked to say that I prefer the more optimistic reading of the book and of Libby's fate. But I think there's a real question there, whether Libby can change. And I think that for me, it remains as a possibility, but as something that has not yet been decided, has not yet materialized. It's by definition an open ending.
Love that. It's a little more complicated. It asks more of the reader, doesn't it?
Yeah.
No easy packaged answers.
Yeah.
Just more questions. We have a question from Susan Lippman. What writers are you reading and who do you admire?
I just last week read 5 short novels by Italian Natalia Ginsburg. She's probably been translated into English, right? The Hebrew translation is fabulous. And the last time I read these novels, I was 14. It was 20 years ago. And I took the books from my parents' library and read them. And obviously I forgot everything.
Mhm.
And it was published again in Hebrew in a renewed translation. And I just fell in love with her stories of unrequited love and her protagonists who are sort of emotionally wasted and always on the verge. And everything I try to write now is influenced by Natalia Ginsburg. And I think she's absolutely brilliant. I read this past summer, I read Tove Ditlevsen's Copenhagen trilogy. Have you read it?
Yeah, I love it.
I think it's brilliant.
Wonderful. I'm in the middle of she has a novella called The Faces that I was reading actually in tandem with this, and I think you would really like it. It's about a woman in an institution. It's terrifying and disturbing, and I think you would enjoy it.
I also, once every 4 or 5 years, I reread Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I think I was probably 15 or 16 when I first read it in an old Hebrew translation. Then a few years later in college, I read it in the original. And ever since, this is something that this is a book that I take into my hands every few years and reread it. And it never loses its charm for me. And obviously her way of constructing a stream of consciousness has really influenced me. I read quite a lot of poetry, and actually when I wrote Love, most of what I read was poetry, both English and American and Hebrew poetry. So I have on my bookshelf behind me Anne Sexton's Complete Poems, for example, which is a book I find that I return to quite a bit. I read Emily Dickinson. I feel that I never managed to truly understand her imagery, but I fell in love with it a few years ago, and I read her quite a lot. I'm trying to think of other books that I recently read. Mostly Natalia Ginsburg.
She wrote Family Lexicon, right?
Right.
And, yeah, I love that one.
And this, I think there's The City and the Home. I think it was translated, or The Home and the City, which is just beautiful.
Yeah. What a genius way to tell a story.
Yeah.
Through sort of like singular language among the family.
Yeah.
Really. It's how do you feel about structure? I mean, I was going to ask you, because the structure of this book is so particular, and I just picture you like moving pieces around and like feeling your way through. Is that am I projecting? Is that how the process went?
Yeah, for things did move around. For a long while, I thought that the sort of infrastructure of the book, or the organizing sort of principle of it, was that everything that happens in the book has already happened and is going to happen again, only worse this time.
Wow.
So I really worked with repetition, both on the level of each sentence and on the level of the plot. it was really important to me to not write a traditional plot in which A leads to B, which then leads to C. I wanted to write something that is more similar to a circle, say,
Yeah.
or
Speaking of Virginia
fractal.
Woolf, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Susan Littman has another question. Has the increased acceptance of women writers by publishing houses had any impact on your writing?
I just feel very lucky to have my work read so seriously, and I think it has to do with the way women writers are accepted today. It's I feel that I feel that there's really a shift that is happening right now in how women's fiction is perceived. So I quoted earlier Miranda July, but I do think that it's a time when women writers are perceived much more seriously. And I feel really lucky to be able to publish in this time.
I think first of all, we have to define woman though. I'm joking, sort of.
Yeah, and women's fiction, right.
Women, what is a woman? Is it a person with a vagina? Is it a person with a womb? Is it a person with a menstrual cycle? Is it a person who has ever had a menstrual cycle? Is it a person whose menstrual cycle is chemically disabled? Anyway,
Yeah.
story for another time, perhaps.
No, these are excellent questions.
Now you have me in mind of a line from this book. Excuse me. This book, do you know this writer? She was just published. I hadn't heard of her. She met a terrible end, very young. She was a very good friend of Susan Sontag's, and I think Sontag's son has written the introduction. But there's a line here that I'm not gonna be able to find it, but woman is part more than human, part less than human, and part human. Another one I think that your book is
so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway, books. Do we have any other questions before we wrap up? Any other questions? I'm so happy that English speakers can now commune with this phenomenal, rich, dense, and yet short and readable in whatever kind of attention span anyone has left. It's a privilege to talk to you. Can I ask you one more question? What you're not at university.
I think my
we have a glitch. We have a time lapse.
I think my internet connection is kind of unstable. Yeah.
Unstable.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, totally. You're back.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask you about your academic work. Like you were at University of Michigan, hated it, left. Now you're still pursuing your PhD.
Yeah. I am writing about representations of sleep in modern Hebrew poetry.
Sleep.
Sleep. Yeah. Yes.
While you forego sleep to talk to us right now at 2 a.m. in Tel Aviv.
True. That's very true.
So funny. Sleep. Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah. So I'm writing about sleeping beauties and murderous lovers and men looking at their lovers asleep. It's fascinating. I have to say that quite similarly to what I did at Michigan when I was writing love instead of writing my dissertation, I still find that most of the time what I do is write fiction instead of doing my research.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
it's a terrible delusional hobby, fiction. Should get back to work. No, just kidding. Write more fiction.
Yeah. It's so
Why do you need a
enticing,
PhD?
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you dead set on the PhD? Are you gonna come hell or high water?
I am going to finish writing it, definitely.
And
Yeah.
then you may go back to writing fiction?
I'm writing fiction all the time. When I wrote Love, I remember reaching to the end of each chapter, telling myself, okay, I said everything that I had to say. What am I going to write now? But I think as Love was published and I continued writing, I finally realized that that really writing is what I do. This is my work. This is my profession, and I enjoy it immensely. There's a quote attributed to an Israeli playwright, and he said, a writer is someone who finds writing difficult. So this is true to an extent, but also I think a writer is someone who finds writing just beautifully rich and the most wonderful thing or profession a person can choose for himself or herself.
Marge Piercy wrote in a poem that's sort of designed to discourage young people from taking up writing. She says, you have to like it more than being loved. You have to like the work more than being loved.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
Right. Nell Zink points out that in Tel Aviv, it's 3:30.
It
yes,
is
but when we started, it was 2 something. So
yeah.
Are you going to sleep in?
Probably. My cat sleeps beside me, so I'm going to join her.
Sounds delightful. It's such a treat to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elisa.
Yeah.
Thanks for everyone.
Thank you both so much. And thank you all for being here. Once again, the link is in the chat to buy. Make sure to put Greenlight Events 10 for 10% off. And yeah, thank you for a great conversation. And we'll see you all next time. Good night, Maayan.
Good night.
Bye, thanks.